The sun was setting over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow over the village that seemed to make everything appear more peaceful than it truly was. The village square, as always, was alive with the small sounds of evening children's laughter, the clink of teacups in open windows, and the occasional bark of a dog chasing after a stray squirrel. To the casual observer, it was a place untouched by time, where nothing could go wrong. Chapter 01. But in the quiet of the tea garden that afternoon, something was about to shatter that illusion of serenity. The village's garden party, a cherished, local tradition that had taken place annually for decades, was underway. It was a gathering of old friends, young families, and curious visitors who had come to witness the beauty of the town, all under the guise of polite conversation and genteel charm. Miss Marple, as ever, was seated in the corner of the garden, near the edge of the flower beds, watching the activities unfold with the same sharp eye that had helped her solve so many mysteries. She was no stranger to the village, having lived here for many years. And though she was often underestimated for her quiet demeanor, Miss Marple knew the intricacies of St. Mary Mead better than anyone else. She took a sip from her teacup, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the people around her. The gossip, the subtle gestures, and the whispered conversations were a familiar dance. She didn't need to be part of it to know what was happening. All she needed was to listen and observe. But that afternoon, her attention was drawn to something, unusual, something that didn't fit the peaceful, idyllic scene before her. There, in the midst of the crowd, was Clara Ashton, a young woman of no more than 25, who had been looking around anxiously as though she was searching for someone. Miss Marple watched as Clara's gaze flickered toward the far corner of the garden, where she had been speaking with a man early at Ward Pierce, a charming but reclusive gentleman who had recently moved to St. Mary Mead after the death of his wife. Clara's eyes met Miss Marple's for a brief second, and Miss Marple offered a small, polite smile. Clara quickly averted her gaze, looking uneasy. She turned to leave, walking hastily toward the gates of the garden. Miss Marple's sharp eyes followed the young woman's movement, noting the way Clara's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her dress. The young woman had been outwardly composed moments ago, but now her unease was palpable. "Miss Marple, is everything all right?" It was Dorothy Thompson, one of the village's more outspoken residents, who came over to chat as Miss Marple looked around the garden. "You've been unusually quiet today." Marple smiled warmly at Dorothy, who was always eager for the latest village gossip. "Oh, nothing to worry about, Dorothy. Just observing the goings-on, as usual." Dorothy leaned in, lowering her voice. "I think there's something strange going on with Clara Ashton. She's been acting odd all day, hasn't she? I don't know what it is, but I've seen her glance at Edward Pierce more than once. It's almost as though she's trying to avoid him, but then she keeps looking at him. Very odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Clara, who was now standing by the garden gates, staring into the distance. She hadn't noticed Clara's earlier glance at Pierce, but there was certainly an unease about her now. The young woman's behavior was unusual, to say the least, and Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder what had caused the sudden shift. "Well, I suppose it's just the excitement of the garden party getting to everyone, Dorothy," Miss Marple said with a small smile, trying to downplay the situation. But inwardly, she made a note to keep an eye on the young woman. The party continued, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Clara Ashton. Something wasn't right. Clara had seemed perfectly pleasant earlier in the interaction with Edward. Pierce didn't seem out of the ordinary, but there was an edge to her behavior now that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. The evening wore on, and the guests began to disperse, the sun sinking lower in the sky. Miss Marple rose to leave. Her curiosity piqued, and as she turned to walk back to her cottage, she noticed Clara once again standing by the gate. But this time, she was not alone. Edward Pierce stood beside her, exchanged a few words, but Clara's body language was stiff and defensive. Edward appeared to be trying to convince her of something, but Clara seemed unconvinced. The two shared a few more tense moments, and then, to Miss Marple's surprise, Clara abruptly turned on her heel and walked away, heading toward the distant hills. Disappearing into the fading twilight, Edward Pierce watched her leave, his face expressionless, before turning to walk back into the garden. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. The scene was not what it appeared to be. Something had transpired between the two, but Miss Marple couldn't quite place her finger on it. Was it a disagreement? A conversation of a more private nature? Whatever it was, Miss Marple knew it was important. She continued her walk back home, her mind now preoccupied with the strange scene she had witnessed. As she approached her front door, she paused, casting one last glance toward the village square. The street was empty now, save for a few lingering villagers. But Miss Marple's instincts told her that something significant had just occurred, and the ripple effects of whatever had happened today would be felt soon. That night, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, sipping a cup of tea and reviewing the events of the day, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by the familiar face of Constable Hawkins, his expression grim. "Miss Marple, we have a situation," Hawkins said, his voice low. "Clara Ashton has gone missing." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had feared this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud made the reality of the situation more acute. "What happened?" she asked, her tone calm but full of concern. "We've searched the village, but there's no sign of her. Her family is frantic, but no one knows where she went. The last we saw her, she was walking toward the hills. We found her hat just beyond the garden gates. But that's it." Miss Marple's mind immediately began to work, her thoughts racing. Clara's sudden departure, her strange behavior earlier that afternoon now, it all made sense. The missing young woman had been on edge, and the conversation with Edward Pierce had likely triggered whatever had caused her to leave. "I must go out there, Hawkins," Miss Marple said, already moving toward the door. "I believe I know where she might have gone." The hills on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead were quiet, the cool evening air carrying the scent of damp earth and the fading remnants of the storm. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the path ahead, the dim light from the distant village casting long shadows across the ground. She could sense that something important was unfolding. Clara Ashton's disappearance was no accident. Hawkins followed closely behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they made their way to the foot of the hills. The faintest trace of footprints marked the path, leading them toward a small, secluded copse of trees. As they reached the clearing, Miss Marple stopped, her heart quickening. There, at the base of one of the trees, lay Clara Ashton. Her body was limp, her face pale, and Miss Marple knew at once that it was too late. "Clara," Hawkins whispered in disbelief, kneeling beside her. But Miss Marple was already at her side, examining the scene. The young woman had been lying in the dirt for some time, her dress torn and her hair matted with the wet earth. There was no sign of a struggle, just an eerie stillness that seemed out of place. Miss Marple's gaze moved over the body, her sharp eyes catching something glinting in the grass beside Clara's hand, a small silver locket. Miss Marple's heart skipped. The locket was familiar. She had seen it before, around the neck of someone she knew all too well. "This is no coincidence," Miss Marple murmured, her mind already racing. The pieces were falling into place, and the identity of the killer was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The truth had always been closer than anyone realized. And now the final act was at hand. As Hawkins stood, his face pale and shaken, Miss Marple looked up at the distant village, where the lights still burned brightly. The mystery of St. Mary Mead was almost complete, and the murderer would soon be revealed. But as Miss Marple turned away from the scene, one thing was certain: the truth had finally come home. The morning after Clara Ashton's disappearance, the village of St. Mary Mead was unusually still. Miss Marple had not yet had time to digest the events of the previous evening, but as she walked through the village square, the absence of chatter, the silence hanging heavily in the air, felt like the calm before a storm. The garden party from the day before, once a charming local tradition, now felt distant, like a broken memory. The fear that something had gone terribly wrong in her peaceful village was growing. Miss Marple had seen many things in her time, a great deal more than most would ever imagine. But there was something about Clara's disappearance that felt different, something deeper. She had always been able to sense when there was a hint of dread in the air, and right now she could feel it in every step, every corner of the village. People were scared. They were whispering, casting nervous glances at one another, unsure of what was happening. It was the kind of fear that was born from something far more insidious than a missing person. It was the fear of something far darker, creeping into the fabric of their lives. As Miss Marple walked past the local baker's shop, she noticed that the windows were tightly shut. Something quite uncharacteristic for the shop, which usually had a steady stream of customers. The street was more or less empty. The bustling market that was normally a feature of this time of day had been replaced by an eerie quiet. She had spoken to Mrs. Treadwell the previous evening, and though the woman had been helpful, she had also been less than forthcoming. There had been something in her eyes, something that hinted at a knowledge she was not sharing. Miss Marple had learned long ago that when people were reluctant to speak, it was often because they were hiding something of great importance. The clock tower in the square struck the hour as Miss Marple turned her attention to the group of villagers gathered near the fountain. The usual gossip was absent from the group. Instead, there was an air of suspicion as they stood huddled, murmuring among themselves. Miss Marple could hear bits of conversation drifted toward her. "She's been gone all night, you know," one man said quietly, his voice tinged with anxiety. "And no one's seen a trace of her." "What if something's happened? Need to search the woods," another voice added. "Someone has to go out there. It's not right. She was last seen heading that way, after all." Miss Marple stopped just outside the group, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had been in the village long enough to know that the woods on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead had always held an air of mystery. There were stories, whispers of things that had happened there over the years, things that people had stopped speaking about. The woods were the last place Clara had been seen before she vanished, and Miss Marple felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she thought about that fact. "Has anyone spoken to Edward Pierce yet?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but laced with quiet authority. The villagers turned to her, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. They had not expected her to speak up. Miss Marple's reputation for quietly observing from the sidelines was well known, and she rarely involved herself directly. But this time was different. "Edward," the man who had spoken before, repeated, looking confused. "No, not yet. He hasn't been seen much since yesterday, to be honest." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She had observed Edward Pierce and Clara Ashton the day before at the garden party, and their interactions had been subtle. There had been an undercurrent of something between them, something unspoken. But Miss Marple was not one to jump to conclusions without facts, and her intuition, sharp as ever, told her to look closely at Pierce. "I just have a feeling," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as ever, but filled with quiet resolve. "People sometimes think they can hide what they truly feel, but I've learned over the years that emotions are often written on a person's face in their gestures. Edward Pierce is someone who has been rather isolated, hasn't he? A newcomer to the village, and always keeping to himself." A few villagers nodded, and Miss Marple could see their unease grow. Her observations had struck a chord. The fact that Edward Pierce had come to St. Mary Mead recently, seemingly without reason or connection to anyone, had raised suspicions. Now, with Clara's disappearance looming large in their minds, it was clear that many were beginning to see the connection. But surely, you don't think that one of the women began, only to be interrupted by Miss Marple. People are often more complicated than we realize, my dear, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of her years of experience. It's not just about who they appear to be on the surface, it's about what lies beneath. And sometimes, what lies beneath is much darker than anyone expects. Her words hung in the air, leaving the villagers with much to consider. Marple could see the doubt creeping into their minds, the unsettling feeling that perhaps they had all missed something crucial. As much as she wished it weren't true, she knew that the mystery at the heart of Clara Ashton's disappearance was far deeper than anyone had imagined. Have you found any sign of Clara, Miss Marple? Dorothy Thompson, one of the village's more talkative residents, asked, her voice trembling slightly. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward Dorothy, and she saw the concern etched on the woman's face. Despite her usual gossiping ways, Dorothy had always cared deeply for the people in the village. Clara's disappearance had affected her more than she would admit, and Miss Marple knew that this fear of the unknown was unsettling the entire village. I'm afraid I have not, Dorothy, Miss Marple replied softly, but we will find her. She has simply become a part of something bigger than herself, and we must uncover what that is. The village was beginning to turn on itself. It was a subtle shift, but one Miss Marple had seen before. People were starting to question their neighbors, their friends, their acquaintances. Fear had a way of turning everyone into a suspect, even those with no reason to be involved. She could see it in the eyes of the villagers as they glanced at each other with growing suspicion. Do you think she's still alive? Hawkins, who had quietly joined them at the edge of the gathering, asked, his voice full of concern. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she turned toward him. I don't know, Hawkins, but we must find out, and quickly. It was then that Miss Marple saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure standing at the edge of the square, watching them. Edward Pierce. His tall, gaunt form was barely visible in the growing dusk, but Miss Marple recognized him immediately. He had been there earlier too, when Clara had left so abruptly. His presence now was too much to be coincidental. Without a word, Miss Marple turned and walked toward him, her pace measured, calm, and deliberate. Hawkins and the others followed her, though none of them said a word. Edward Pierce did not move as she approached, though Miss Marple could see his eyes narrow slightly. He had been expecting this, she realized. Well, Mr. Pierce, Miss Marple said, her voice steady but sharp. I was just thinking about our conversation yesterday. I believe there's something you should explain to me. Edward Pierce's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple, he said, his voice colder than it had been the day before. There's nothing to explain. I think you'll find that there is, Miss Marple said gently, though there was steel in her words. We've all heard strange things about you, Mr. Pierce. You've been in this village for such a short time, and yet something seems off. Clara Ashton's disappearance, for example, would be remiss of me not to ask if you know anything about it. Pierce's eyes flickered for just a moment, and Miss Marple knew that she had struck a nerve. The game had begun, and Miss Marple would make sure she was the one who had the final word. Perhaps you'll tell me everything you know, Mr. Pierce, Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. Or perhaps you'll choose to stay silent and allow the truth to find you anyway. As Miss Marple waited for his response, she could feel the final piece of the puzzle shifting into place. The mystery of Clara Ashton was far from over, but it was about to be solved. Chapter 02. The quiet of St. Mary Mead seemed to thicken with every passing hour. It's a small, picturesque village, so often a haven for peace and simplicity. had been irrevocably shaken by the disappearance of Clara Ashton. The village square, which usually hummed with chatter and gossip, now felt suffocated by the anxiety that hung in the air like a heavy fog. People went about their usual routines, but the pallor of uncertainty was evident on their faces. Miss Marple had always known that beneath the surface of a quiet village like St. Mary Mead, there existed currents of tension, suspicion, and intrigue. But it was only in the wake of Clara's disappearance that these tensions were brought to light. The villagers' concern was palpable, but it was tainted with the unease that came with the unknown, the fear that someone among them was hiding something. After a conversation with Edward Pierce earlier that day, Miss Marple had gone home to her cottage, where she sat in quiet reflection. The questions had piled up faster than the answers, and each conversation left her with more pieces of a puzzle she was still far from solving. It's clear that Clara Ashton's disappearance was only the surface of a much deeper mystery. But who had the motive, and why? What had truly happened between Clara and Edward Pierce, and how did it fit into the growing web of deceit and secrecy she had begun to untangle? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, Miss Marple felt a sudden urgency to uncover the truth. The village was on edge, and she knew that if the mystery wasn't solved soon, suspicion would continue to fester, and it might not be long before people turned on one another. The next morning, she set out for the Darby estate. Her previous visits had left her with more questions than answers. The Darbys, with their wealth and influence, were always at the center of the village's affairs. But Miss Marple sensed there was more to their story than what appeared on the surface. The tragic death of Edith Darby and the recent disappearance of Clara had to be connected. Somehow there was no such thing as coincidence in a village like this. Miss Marple felt the steady pull of a larger conspiracy, but the pieces were still scattered, waiting for her to bring them together. As she walked along the tree-lined path to the Darby estate, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to Edward Pierce. His behavior had been unsettling, and his reaction to her questions earlier had only deepened her suspicion. The man had been too calm, too composed, considering the gravity of the situation. He had no real explanation for his odd behavior at the garden party, and Miss Marple could see that his involvement in Clara's disappearance was not an accident. When Miss Marple arrived at the Darby estate, she was greeted by Mr. Hargrove, who seemed unusually tense. The usually collected butler had an air of apprehension about him, and his usual stoic expression was replaced by a furrowed brow. Miss Marple, Mr. Hargrove, greeted her with a polite nod, but his tone was clipped. "Mrs. Darby is expecting you." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple replied, noting his unease. "I won't take up much of her time." As they made their way through the grand hall, Miss Marple's senses sharpened. The house, always imposing and dignified, now felt unnervingly cold. It was as though the walls themselves were steeped in secrets Miss Marple was determined to uncover. Mrs. Darby had been evasive during their last conversation, but Miss Marple knew the woman was hiding something. It was time to press further. When they reached the drawing room, Mrs. Darby was waiting, seated in her usual chair by the fire. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn against the daylight, creating a suffocating atmosphere of concealment. Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered up as Miss Marple entered, but there was no warmth in her greeting. The woman's face was pale, her posture rigid, and Miss Marple could see the strain in her expression. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice a little too calm. "I was wondering when you'd come back. I take it you've been busy with the search for Clara." "I have been, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft but firm. "But I find myself with more questions than answers. And I believe you know more than you've let on." Mrs. Darby's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple could feel the woman's reluctance, the unspoken words hanging in the air. There was something more to this, something that Mrs. Darby wasn't willing to admit. I understand that your family has been involved in many dealings over the years. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple continued, watching her closely. But I have a feeling that the land deals and your family's wealth are not the only things at play here. I believe there is a connection between Clara's disappearance, the Darby family, and a man named Edward Pierce. And I suspect that you know more than you're willing to share. Mrs. Darby stiffened at the mention of Edward Pierce's name, but she didn't speak. Okay, silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple had hit a nerve, and she wasn't about to back down now. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but insistent, I know you're afraid, but withholding the truth only makes things worse. Clara's disappearance, Edith Darby's death, these are not isolated events. They are connected, and I believe you know how. Mrs. Darby's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the fire. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right, Mrs. Darby admitted, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and fear. It's all connected. Clara's disappearance, Edith's death, they're part of something much larger, something I can no longer control. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Darby's face. Tell me what happened, Mrs. Darby. Tell me everything. The truth is the only way to end this. Mrs. Darby took a deep breath, her hands still trembling. It started with the land deals, of course, she began, her voice shaking as she spoke. But it wasn't just about the land, it was about power, control. My husband made deals with men like Carrington, men who wanted more than just land. They wanted influence, control over the village, over everyone. And when Edith started to ask questions, when she started to dig into what was really going on, she had to be stopped. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the pieces began to fall into place. Edith Darby had uncovered something too dangerous, something that had put her life at risk. And Clara, Miss Marple realized, had become entangled in this web of deceit because of her connection to the Darby family. Mrs. Darby continued, her voice cracking with emotion. And Edward Pierce, he was involved, but he wasn't supposed to be. I think he got caught up in it all. He wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let him. And when Clara found out, she tried to run, too. That's why she left, she thought. She could escape the truth, but, they found her. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, digesting the information. It was clearer now. The murders, the disappearances, they were all part of a much larger plot, one that was driven by greed and the hunger for control. And at the center of it all was Edward Pierce, whose role in Clara's disappearance was far more complicated than it had seemed. Mrs. Darby's face was pale, her hands trembling. I never wanted this, Miss Marple. I didn't know what my husband was really doing, what he had become involved in, but now I can't stop it. I can't stop them. Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. It's not too late, Mrs. Darby. The truth can still come to light, but you have to be willing to face it. There was a long silence as Mrs. Darby's tears fell quietly onto her hands. Miss Marple stood up, her resolve unwavering. She had the information she needed. Now it was time to act. Stay strong, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. The truth will be revealed. And when it is, the real killer will be exposed for all to see. As Miss Marple left the Darby estate, her mind was already racing. The killer's identity was drawing closer, and the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The web of deceit was beginning to unravel, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through to the very end. The quiet of St. Mary Mead seemed to thicken with every passing hour. The small, picturesque village, so often a haven for peace and simplicity, had been irrevocably shaken by the disappearance of Clara Ashton. The village square, which usually hummed with chatter and gossip, now felt suffocated by the anxiety that hung in the air like a heavy fog. People went about their usual routines, but the pallor of uncertainty was evident on their faces. Miss Marple had always known that beneath the surface of a quiet village like St. Mary Mead, there existed currents of tension, suspicion, and intrigue, but it was only in the wake of Clara's disappearance that these tensions were brought to light. The villagers' concern was palpable, but it was tainted with the unease that came with the unknown, the fear that someone among them was hiding something. After her conversation with Edward Pierce earlier that day, Miss Marple had gone home to her cottage, where she sat in quiet reflection. The questions had piled up faster than the answers, and each conversation left her with more pieces of a puzzle she was still far from solving. It was clear that Clara Ashton's disappearance was only the surface of a much deeper mystery. But who had the motive, and why? What had truly happened between Clara and Edward Pierce, and how did it fit into the growing web of deceit and secrecy she had begun to untangle? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, Miss Marple felt a sudden urgency to uncover the truth. The village was on edge, and she knew that if the mystery wasn't solved soon, suspicion would continue to fester, and it might not be long before people turned on one another. The next morning, she set out for the Darby estate. Her previous visits had left her with more questions than answers. The Darbys, with their wealth and influence, were always at the center of the village's affairs. But Miss Marple sensed there was more to their story than what appeared on the surface. The tragic death of Edith Darby and the recent disappearance of Clara had to be connected somehow. There was no such thing as coincidence in a village like this. Miss Marple felt the steady pull of a larger conspiracy, but the pieces were still scattered, waiting for her to bring them together. As she walked along the tree-lined path to the Darby estate, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to Edward Pierce. His behavior had been unsettling, and his reaction to her questions earlier had only deepened her suspicion. The man had been too calm, too composed, considering the gravity of the situation. He had no real explanation for his odd behavior at the garden party, and Miss Marple could see that his involvement in Clara's disappearance was not an accident. When Miss Marple arrived at the Darby estate, she was greeted by Mr. Hargrove, who seemed unusually tense. The usually collected butler had an air of apprehension about him, and his usual stoic expression was replaced by a furrowed brow. Miss Marple. Mr. Hargrove greeted her with a polite nod, but his tone was clipped. "Mrs. Darby is expecting you." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple replied, noting his unease. "I won't take up much of her time." As they made their way through the grand hall, Miss Marple's senses sharpened. The house, always imposing and dignified, now felt unnervingly cold. It was as though the walls themselves were steeped in secrets. Miss Marple was determined to uncover. Mrs. Darby had been evasive during their last conversation, but Miss Marple knew the woman was hiding something. It was time to press further. When they reached the drawing room, Mrs. Darby was waiting, seated in her usual chair by the fire. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn against the daylight, creating a suffocating atmosphere of concealment. Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered up as Miss Marple entered, but there was no warmth in her greeting. The woman's face was pale, her posture rigid, and Miss Marple could see the strain in her expression. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice a little too calm. "I was wondering when you'd come back. Can I take it you've been busy with the search for Clara?" "I have been, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft but firm. "But I find myself with more questions than answers, and I believe you know more than you've let on." Mrs. Darby's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple could feel the woman's reluctance, the unspoken words hanging in the air. There was something more to this, something that Mrs. Darby wasn't willing to admit. I understand that your family has been involved in many dealings over the years, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple continued, watching her closely. But I have a feeling that the land deals in your family's wealth are not the only things at play here. I believe there is a connection between Clara's disappearance, the Darby family, and a man named Edward Pierce. And I suspect that you know more than you're willing to share. Mrs. Darby stiffened at the mention of Edward Pierce's name, but she didn't speak. Her silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple had hit a nerve, and she wasn't about to back down now. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but insistent, I know you're afraid, but withholding the truth only makes things worse. Clara's disappearance, Edith Darby's death, these are not isolated events. They are connected, and I believe you know how. Mrs. Darby's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the fire. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right, Mrs. Darby admitted, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and fear. It's all connected. Clara's disappearance, Edith's death. They're part of something much larger, something I can no longer control. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Darby's face. Tell me what happened, Mrs. Darby. Tell me everything. The truth is the only way to end this. Mrs. Darby took a deep breath, her hands still trembling. It started with the land deals, of course, she began, her voice shaking as she spoke. But it wasn't just about the land, it was about power, its control. My husband made deals with men like Carrington, men who wanted more than just land. They wanted influence, control over the village, over everyone. And when Edith started to ask questions, when she started to dig into what was really going on, she had to be stopped. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the pieces began to fall into place. Edith Darby had uncovered something too dangerous, something that had put her life at risk. And Clara, Miss Marple realized, had become entangled in this web of deceit because of her connection to the Darby family. Mrs. Darby continued, her voice cracking with emotion. And Edward Pierce, he was involved, but he wasn't supposed to be. I think he got caught up in it all. He wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let him. And when Clara found out, she tried to run too. That's why she left, she thought. She could escape the truth, but ... they found her. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, digesting the information. It was clearer now. The murders, the disappearances, they were all part of a much larger plot, one that was driven by greed and the hunger for control. And at the center of it all was Edward Pierce, whose role in Clara's disappearance was far more complicated than it had seemed. Mrs. Darby's face was pale, her hands trembling. I never wanted this, Miss Marple. I didn't know what my husband was really doing, what he had become involved in. But now, I can't stop it. I can't stop them. Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. It's not too late, Mrs. Darby. The truth can still come to light. But you have to be willing to face it. There was a long silence as Mrs. Darby's tears fell quietly onto her hands. Miss Marple stood up, her resolve unwavering. She had the information she needed. Now it was time to act. Stay strong, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. The truth will be revealed, and when it is, the real killer will be exposed for all to see. As Miss Marple left the Darby estate, her mind was already racing. The killer's identity was drawing closer, and the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The web of deceit was beginning to unravel, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through to the very end. You said, now, generate section of the story, ensuring smooth continuity from the previous section. It's maintained the same pacing, character, development, and mystery build up without premature reveals. Keep the word count consistent, progressing the narrative naturally while leading into the next section. And the part should be the 1100 to 1200 words ChatGPT said. Chapter 03. The following days passed in a quiet hum, like a village holding its breath, waiting for anything to happen. The search for Clara Ashton had turned into a quiet, methodical process, with the village's residents coming together to comb through the woods, retracing her steps as they tried to make sense of her disappearance. But as each day stretched into the next, the answers remained elusive. Miss Marple, however, could feel the tension building beneath the surface. The village was changing. The idyllic calmness of St. Mary Mead was being replaced by a palpable unease, a fear that settled into the bones of its inhabitants. They were beginning to look at each other differently. Trust was fraying, and the secrecy that had once cloaked the village like a comforting fog was now a heavy weight, suffocating them all. Miss Marple had not been idle. She had spent the days since her last visit to the Darby estate, quietly observing, listening, and reflecting on everything she had learned so far. The truth, she knew, was always more complex than it seemed on the surface. The Darbys, with their wealth and influence, had created a life that seemed perfect. Two outsiders, but Miss Marple could see the cracks that ran deeper than anyone had dared to look. On the third day after Clara's disappearance, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the Darby estate again. Mrs. Darby had not made herself available for another meeting, but Miss Marple knew that she would have to confront her again soon. There was still something Mrs. Darby was hiding, something important that had yet to be revealed. She had given Miss Marple a glimpse of the truth, but it was still shrouded in half-truths and omissions. As Miss Marple approached the gates of the Darby estate, she noticed that the atmosphere felt different. The house, always a symbol of wealth and stability, now seemed distant, almost cold. The tall iron gates that led up to the house stood as a silent guard, a symbol of the Darby family's ironclad control over the village. But Miss Marple had learned to read the subtle cues of such places, and she could sense the change. The air was heavy with the weight of secrets, of something that had been hidden far too long. She was greeted by Mr. Hargrove, the butler, who seemed more flustered than usual. His expression was tight, his eyes darting nervously as he led her inside. There was a palpable tension in the air, and Miss Marple noted how the usual air of polite composure that had always defined the Darby estate now seemed strained. The servants moved about quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone, as if they, too, were caught in the web of secrets that had begun to unravel. Miss Marple, Mr. Hargrove said in his usual formal manner, but there was an edge to his voice. Mrs. Darby is in the sitting room. She is expecting you. As Miss Marple entered the room, she found Mrs. Darby sitting near the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The once proud matriarch of the family seemed smaller somehow, the weight of her secrets bearing down on her with each passing moment. She looked up at Miss Marple, her expression unreadable, but there was an undeniable shift in her demeanor. Mrs. Darby had been, at least outwardly, a woman of control, but now that control was slipping away. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said, softly, her voice quieter than usual. I must apologize for not seeing you sooner. I been distracted. Miss Marple didn't immediately sit. Instead, she stood by the door, her eyes scanning the room, her mind sifting through the details. The room was grand, with dark wood paneling and heavy curtains that kept the outside world at bay. It was a room built for appearances, designed to give the impression of power and privilege. But to Miss Marple, it felt suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. I believe we need to talk about what happened to Clara, and about your family's involvement in all of this. Mrs. Darby's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I've told you what I know," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "There's nothing more to say." Miss Marple walked slowly toward the fireplace, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Darby's face. "I don't believe that's true, Mrs. Darby. You're hiding something, something important." Clara's disappearance, Edith Darby's death, and the involvement of Edward Pierce, these events are connected, eh? And I believe you know how. For a long moment, Mrs. Darby didn't respond. She stared into the fire, her fingers clenched tightly around the armrests of her chair. Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. It was as if Mrs. Darby were trying to hold herself together, but the strain was too much. "I don't know what you want from me," Mrs. Darby said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "I've told you the truth. You must believe me." "I do believe you, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet but insistent. "But I think you're holding back. There's something more, something you haven't told me about. Edward Pierce and Clara Ashton. Something that ties them to your family's history. Something that might explain why Clara disappeared." Mrs. Darby's eyes widened slightly, and Miss Marple caught the brief flicker of fear in her gaze. It was subtle, but it was there. Mrs. Darby was hiding something. Miss Marple knew that she was on the brink of uncovering it. "It's not just about Clara," Mrs. Darby said, her voice shaking. "It's about all of us, my husband, my children, our legacy. Edward Pierce. He's been a part of our lives for so long, but I didn't know who he really was. I didn't know what he had become. Clara, she knew too much. She found out things that she shouldn't have. She became a threat, and I couldn't protect her. I couldn't stop what was coming." Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Darby's face. "What did Clara find out, Mrs. Darby? What did she know that made her a threat?" Mrs. Darby took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "Edward Pierce was involved in the land deals, but not in the way you think. He didn't just work with us. He was part of something much larger, something that her voice faltered, and she looked away as though ashamed to continue. We were all involved in a scheme, Miss Marple. The Darbys, the Treadwells, the Prestons people were using us, using our land and our influence for their own gain. And when Edith found out, she became a liability. She started asking questions, and Edward." Mrs. Darby's voice cracked, her hands trembling. Edward was the one who silenced her. Miss Marple felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The truth, at last, was spilling out, and with it, the web of deceit that had ensnared the entire village. The land deals, the murders, the power struggles, all of it had been a carefully orchestrated plan, and Clara had stumbled into the heart of it. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her mind working quickly. "And now Edward Pierce is involved in Clara's disappearance." She knew too much, just like Edith did. Mrs. Darby nodded, her face pale. "Yes, I tried to stop him, but I couldn't. And now Clara is gone. I fear that we are all trapped in something much bigger than we ever realized." Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her mind racing. Everything was beginning to fall into place. The Darbys, the Treadwells, the Prestons, the tangled web of their involvement in the land deals. The murders and the power struggles was more complex than she had ever imagined. But the key to it all was Edward Pierce, a man who had quietly manipulated the entire village from behind the scenes. As Miss Marple turned to leave the room, she paused, her thoughts crystal clear. "Mrs. Darby, I will do what I can to bring the truth to light, but I need your help. I need you to tell me everything you know, no matter how painful it may be." Mrs. Darby nodded, her eyes filled with silent tears. Miss Marple turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth was closer than ever, but it came with a heavy price. The pieces were falling into place, and the killer's identity was almost within reach. Miss Marple knew that the final step would require more than just intellect. It would take courage to confront the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight for so long. And the truth, as always, would be more powerful than any secret they had tried to keep buried. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead, and the village, though still buzzing with quiet whispers, was once again draped in the soft stillness that was so characteristic of this place. The usual lullaby of the village birds calling, children's laughter, the clink of cups being set down on tables was muted now. The gardens seemed quieter than usual, and the streets less frequented. The entire village had become more reflective, more uncertain, as the mystery of Clara Ashton's disappearance weighed heavily on their minds. Miss Marple's visit to the Darby estate had left her with more questions than answers. Mrs. Darby had finally spoken of the connections between the Darbys, Edward Pierce, and the land dealings. But as Miss Marple had sat in the sitting room, listening intently, a troubling thought had crossed her mind. There was something that didn't add up. Clara's disappearance, the revelation of family secrets, the shadowy dealings, it all fit together too perfectly. But something was off. A detail that refused to be ignored. The village seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple made her way home that night. The truth was growing nearer, but it felt like walking through a fog. With each step forward made the landscape around her even harder to discern. There was no denying it. Now St. Mary Mead was not the same peaceful village she had known for so long, and whatever had been happening behind closed doors was about to come to light in a way that would shake the village to its very foundations. As she sat in her cottage, the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, Miss Marple reviewed the events in her mind. The Darbys had been at the center of this web, true, but there was one figure who stood at the very heart of it, Edward Pierce. The more she thought about him, the more his presence unsettled her. He had been a constant shadow in this case, present at the garden party, seen with Clara, yet always keeping to himself. Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that he had been the key figure all along, the one who had stirred the pot, only to watch the villagers unravel from a distance. His aloofness wasn't just a personality trait. It was part of his method. Miss Marple stood up and walked over to the small desk where her notes were spread out, her fingers tracing the edges of the papers as she pieced together what she knew. The Darby family's involvement in the land deals, the mysterious deaths, Clara's sudden disappearance, everything pointed to Edward Pierce. But the question remained, what was his ultimate goal? What had he been trying to achieve, and why was he so reluctant to reveal anything? The next day, Miss Marple went to the local library to consult records, hoping to uncover any new information. The library was quiet, the smell of old books filling the air. She sat at a table by the window, carefully flipping through the ledgers and records she had requested. She wasn't expecting a revelation, but something in the back of her mind told her there was more to Pierce than she had yet discovered. It was in the midst of flipping through records relating to the Darby estate that Miss Marple came across a name one that caught her attention immediately. Henry Carrington. The name appeared several times in the land records linked to the Darby family through investments and business dealings. Miss Marple felt a sharp stab of recognition. Carrington had been mentioned briefly before in passing, but now it was clear. His involvement with the Darbys was far more significant than anyone had realized. As she read through the documents, Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Carrington had been involved in numerous transactions, not just with the Darbys, but with several other prominent families in the village. The records spoke of land purchases, investments, and local businesses, and even some oddities in the property, exchanges that seemed to have no clear explanation. But the most intriguing part was the mention of a partnership with a certain Edward Pierce, someone who appeared to have far more influence than anyone had given him credit for. Pierce had been operating behind the scenes. Using Carrington as a front for his own interests, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Edward Pierce was not just an isolated figure in this mystery. He was at the center of a larger operation, a hidden network of powerful figures whose influence had extended far beyond the borders of St. Mary Mead. It was becoming clear now. Carrington and Pierce had been manipulating events in the village for years. But what was the end game? Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara once more. Clara had discovered something she wasn't meant to know, something tied to this network. And when she had threatened to expose it, she had become a target. Miss Marple's heart sank as she realized how fragile life in St. Mary Mead truly was. The village, for all its quiet charm, was a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment the next day. Miss Marple visited the village inn, hoping to speak with a few more people who might have insight into the dealings of Edward Pierce. The inn, though usually a place for the more casual chatter of the village, had become a hub for those seeking answers. As she entered the warm, bustling room, Miss Marple noticed a few familiar faces. The local postmaster was engaged in conversation with a farmer, and several villagers were gathered at the bar. But Miss Marple wasn't looking for idle gossip today. She was after something much more critical. As she made her way to the corner where the innkeeper was wiping down the counter, she caught sight of an older gentleman sitting alone, his weathered face familiar. It was old Mr. Hill, the former lawyer for the Darby estate, who had retired a few years ago. He had always been a source of quiet knowledge when it came to the inner workings of the village. He had known the Darbys, and more importantly, he had known Henry Carrington. Mr. Hill, Miss Marple greeted him warmly as she approached his table. "I hope you're well today, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Always a pleasure to see you. How can I help you today?" Miss Marple sat down, smiling at him politely. "I was hoping you could shed some light on the history of the Darby estate, particularly its dealings with a man named Henry Carrington." Mr. Hill's expression changed slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Carrington, eh? Well, I suppose I could tell you a thing or two, though it's not a name I like to bring up. Carrington was involved in a number of questionable dealings with the Darbys, particularly regarding land acquisitions. His influence extended far beyond St. Mary Mead, and I'd venture to say that he's one of the main reasons the Darbys are in the position they're in now." Miss Marple listened intently, her gaze fixed on Mr. Hill as he spoke. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still gaps in the story that needed to be filled. Carrington wasn't a man to let his intentions be known. You see, Mr. Hill continued, his voice lowering slightly, to manipulate people like Edith Darby, for example, until they did his bidding. But when she started to dig into things, asking questions he didn't want answered, well, she became a liability. That's when things started to go south. Miss Marple felt a shiver run down her spine. "And Edward Pierce?" she asked quietly. Mr. Hill's eyes shifted, his gaze flickering briefly toward the other patrons. In the room, he lowered his voice even further. "Pierce is another story. He's not just some ordinary fellow. He's been working with Carrington for years, but even Carrington has been careful with him. I suspect Pierce was part of the plan to keep the Darbys in line. A bit of muscle, a bit of influence, and all the while pretending to be a man of honor." Miss Marple nodded, her mind working furiously to connect all the dots. "So, you're saying Pierce had a much bigger role in this than anyone realizes?" "Exactly," Mr. Hill replied, his eyes serious now. "And if you're looking for answers, Miss Marple, I'd start with Pierce. He's hiding more than you think." Miss Marple rose from the table, her thoughts already racing ahead. "Thank you, Mr. Hill. You've given me much to consider." As she stepped out of the inn and into the fading light of the day, Miss Marple knew that the answers she sought were finally within reach. But the truth was never as simple as it seemed. There was still more to uncover, and it was clear that the pieces of the puzzle were more tangled than she had originally thought. Edward Pierce was at the heart of it all. The man who had been hiding in plain sight for so long was finally about to be exposed. But Miss Marple knew that the path to the truth would be fraught with danger. And as the sun set over St. Mary Mead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. ChatGPT said. Chapter 04. Miss Marple had spent the last few days quietly reflecting on the information she had gathered. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, but as always, there were still gaps that needed to be filled. The more she dug into the history of the Darby estate, the more she realized that the roots of this mystery stretched far deeper than she had initially imagined. The Darby family, for all their wealth and influence, were nothing more than pawns in a much larger game. And at the heart of it all, Miss Marple knew, stood Edward Pierce, his calm demeanor, his quiet presence at the garden party. His involvement in the disappearance of Clara Ashton, everything pointed to him. But what was his ultimate goal? What had driven him to orchestrate such a complex web of lies, betrayal, and murder? Miss Marple had spent the morning in her small cottage, carefully reviewing the notes she had compiled over the past few weeks. The information she had uncovered was damning, but there was one piece she was still missing. Edward Pierce had been involved in everything: Clara's disappearance, Edith Darby's death, the land deals. But why? What had he stood to gain from all of this? And why had he chosen St. Mary Mead as the backdrop for his machinations? The quiet knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Miss Marple rose from her desk, her thoughts still racing. Quetchy opened the door. She found Constable Hawkins standing in the doorway, his face drawn and weary. "Miss Marple," Hawkins said, his voice tight, "there's been a development. We've found something." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The village had been on edge for days, ever since Clara's disappearance. She had a sinking feeling that this development was going to bring everything into sharper focus. She motioned for Hawkins to come inside, her mind already racing with possibilities. "What have you found, Hawkins?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but filled with an underlying urgency. "We were searching the woods again," Hawkins began, his eyes darting toward the window, as if the very air outside held some unspoken danger. "And we found something. A letter. It was hidden under a pile of leaves just beyond the clearing where Clara was last seen." "A letter," Miss Marple repeated, her interest piqued. "What did it say?" Hawkins hesitated for a moment, then handed Miss Marple a small envelope. The paper was old and brittle, as though it had been hidden for some time. Miss Marple carefully opened it, her fingers steady as she read the words scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Meet me by the old oak tree. Everything must be settled before it's too late. We can't let them win." The letter sent a cold shiver down Miss Marple's spine. The handwriting was unmistakably belonged to Edward Pierce, but the words were even more troubling. The message hinted at something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Something that involved not just Pierce, but someone else as well. "We can't let them win," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "Who is them, I wonder?" Hawkins looked at her closely, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "You don't think Pierce had something to do with Clara's disappearance, do you? The letter was clearly written by him." "Do you think he's involved?" "Hawkins," Miss Marple replied, her tone quiet but certain. "But there's more to this than we're seeing. The letter suggests that Pierce was trying to keep someone quiet, and that them could be anyone. It's not just a simple case of Clara running off or getting caught in a storm. No, this is much more complicated." The constable remained silent for a moment, clearly trying to process the implications of Miss Marple's words. She had been right. So far his confidence in her reasoning had grown over the course of their partnership. But this new information raised more questions than answers. Who were they? And what exactly did Pierce want to settle before it was too late? Miss Marple Hawkins began slowly, his voice strained with concern. You don't think, Clara? Could she have known something about Pierce? Something that would make him want to silence her? Miss Marple's gaze turned inward, her mind sifting through the possibilities. Clara Ashton had been a young woman with much to offer the world. She had been curious, intelligent, and not easily intimidated. If she had uncovered something important about the Darby estate or Pierce's dealings, it could explain her sudden disappearance. But what had she found? What had Clara learned that had made her a target? It's possible, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but heavy with understanding. I believe Clara knew more than anyone realized, and whatever she knew was enough to make her dangerous in the eyes of the people who were trying to control this village. Keynes looked at her, his expression darkening. If Pierce is the one behind this, then we have to act quickly. The longer he's allowed to operate unchecked, the more damage he can do. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts swirling. The village of St. Mary Mead had long been a place of secrets, but now those secrets were threatening to break free. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, and though she was resolute in her determination, there was an unsettling feeling in her chest. The truth was coming to light, but the path to it was growing more treacherous with every step. There's one more thing we must consider. Hawkins, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. The people behind this Carrington, Pierce, and anyone else involved are not just interested in power. They're interested in control, and they won't stop until they have it. I agree, Hawkins said, his tone firm. But what do we do now? How do we catch them? Miss Marple turned to him, her gaze unwavering. We gather more information. We learn everything we can about Edward Pierce and his connections, especially to Carrington. And we wait for them to make a mistake. People like Pierce are too confident in their power. They believe they're untouchable. That's their fatal flaw. As she spoke, Miss Marple's mind began to race with ideas. She had always believed that the smallest detail could unravel the most complex mystery. But now, with the discovery of the letter, it felt as though she was standing on the precipice of the truth. Miss Marple turned to leave, but just as she reached the door, she paused. There's one more thing, she said, her voice thoughtful. We must speak to those closest to Pierce. People like the Treadwells, who might have had dealings with him, and we must be discreet. The truth, Hawkins, is often hidden in plain sight. As she stepped out of the cottage, Miss Marple felt the weight of the coming days ahead. The truth was within reach, but the danger had never been greater. She was no longer just uncovering a simple mystery. She was uncovering a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of the village. And once the truth came to light, there would be no turning back. With each step she took toward the village square, Miss Marple's resolve grew stronger. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the murderer's identity was no longer a matter of if, but when. The storm was coming, and Miss Marple was ready to face it head-on. Tools, Miss Marple spent the next few days carefully gathering more information. Each step bringing her closer to the truth, though the path remained tangled and unclear. The village was starting to feel like a powder keg, and she could sense that things were about to boil over. It was a strange sensation, the calm before a storm, the quiet moments before everything changed forever. The Darby estate had provided her with much-needed insight into the tangled relationships within the village. Mrs. Darby had finally given her a taste of the dark, truths buried beneath the family's carefully maintained image, but there was still much left unsaid. The letter from Edward Pierce, found by Hawkins, had added an entirely new layer to the mystery. It confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Edward Pierce was far more involved than anyone had realized, and his motives were still unclear. What Was Pierce really after? And how did Henry Carrington fit into the equation? The two men seemed to share a connection, though Miss Marple couldn't yet pinpoint its true nature. See, Mary Mead, for all its tranquil charm, was being swept up by a sense of foreboding. The disappearance of Clara Ashton, once an isolated incident, had now become a focal point for fear. The villagers were talking about it more openly now, though they did so in hushed tones, as though afraid the truth might spill from their lips and bring more danger. The daily activities gathering at the post office, meeting at the market. The usual gossip over tea felt somehow different. The weight of suspicion hung in the air, and no one seemed untouched by it. Miss Marple's morning walk took her through the heart of the village. She moved slowly, her keen eyes scanning the faces of those she passed. It was an old habit of hers, watching people, noticing the way they held themselves, the little things that told stories more revealing than words could ever manage. But today, as she made her way past the familiar sights of St. Mary Mead, she could sense something had shifted. The usual morning bustle seemed more subdued, and the chatter in the streets felt strained, as though the villagers were all holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As Miss Marple passed the village green, she spotted a familiar face, Dorothy Thompson, a regular at the local tea shop. Dorothy was standing by the fountain, her back stiff and her face flushed with something between anxiety and agitation. Miss Marple stopped and approached her, offering a warm smile. "Good morning, Dorothy." Miss Marple greeted her in her usual soft tone. "How are you today?" Dorothy turned to face her, her eyes wide with concern. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to think anymore," she said in a hushed voice. "It's all so strange. People are whispering about Clara, about her being involved with Edward Pierce. And now people are saying he's hiding something, that he's the one who knows what really happened." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained composed. She had heard whispers like this before, but now they seemed louder, more insistent. The puzzle pieces were beginning to shift, but there were still questions left to answer. "You're right to be concerned, Dorothy," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm. "There's much more to this than meets the eye, but you must remember, gossip is often the quickest way to cloud the truth. It's important that we look carefully at the facts, not the rumors." Dorothy nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "No, Miss Marple, but I just can't shake the feeling that there's something we're all missing. Something big. Edward Pierce. I can't help but feel he's hiding something, more than just his quiet nature. He was at the center of it all, wasn't he? And now Clara's gone. It doesn't feel right." Miss Marple studied Dorothy's face for a moment, noticing the anxiety that had taken root in her eyes. The village's unease had begun to take its toll. But despite Dorothy's fear, there was a kernel of truth in what she said. Clara's disappearance and Pierce's involvement were more connected than anyone realized. "I understand, Dorothy," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "But we must remain patient. The truth always comes to light, even if it takes a little longer than we expect." Miss Marple smiled kindly before continuing on her way, but as she walked, her thoughts began to churn. Dorothy's words had struck a chord with her. Pierce had indeed been at the center of everything, and now, with Clara's disappearance, it seemed as though the net was tightening around him. What was his connection to Carrington? And why had he been so intent on keeping the truth hidden? Miss Marple paused by the old oak tree near the edge of the village. She had walked this path countless times, and the tree had always struck her as a symbol of stability in an otherwise ever-changing world. But today, it seemed different. Somehow, there was something almost foreboding about it, a silent sentinel, guarding the secrets of the village. She ran her hand along the rough bark, a gesture of quiet reflection. It was then that her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of voices. Turning, Miss Marple saw a small group of villagers gathered near the edge of the woods. They appeared to be deep in conversation, but their faces were tense, their postures stiff. As she drew closer, she could hear snatches of their conversation. But it was only when one of them mentioned the name Edward Pierce that Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Pierce has been acting strange lately," one of the men said, his voice low but full of suspicion. "Ty, he's been here long enough to get comfortable, but there's something about him that doesn't sit right." Another voice spoke up. "You're right, it's always on edge, like he's hiding something. And now, with Clara gone, I bet he's involved in it somehow. If not the disappearance, then something else. We can't let him get away with it." Miss Marple's mind raced as she took in their words. It was clear that the villagers were starting to put the pieces together, but they were drawing their own conclusions. The truth, however, was more complex than they realized. Miss Marple knew that they were dangerously close to the truth, but they had yet to see the full picture. The villagers' whispers were growing louder, but Miss Marple could tell that they were more than just idle gossip. There was real suspicion now, a quiet rage building beneath the surface. She had to move quickly if the village was turning against Pierce. It wouldn't be long before someone took matters into their own hands. She stepped forward, catching the attention of the group. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "I couldn't help but overhear. It seems you're all concerned about Mr. Pierce." The villagers turned to her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple," one of them said, his tone cautious, "we were just talking about Pierce. You think he's involved in Clara's disappearance, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her eyes were sharp. "I believe Mr. Pierce may have more to do with this than anyone realizes, but there's still much to uncover. I would advise you all to be cautious. Sometimes the truth is not as simple as it appears." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but Miss Marple could see that her words had struck a chord. They were afraid, and that fear was clouding their judgment. They had already begun to see Pierce as the villain, but Miss Marple knew the truth was more complicated than that. As she walked away from the group, her thoughts continued to race. Pierce had made his move, and now the village was starting to turn on him. But Miss Marple knew that he wasn't the only one involved. Henry Carrington's name still hung over the village like a shadow, and Miss Marple was certain that the man's influence had played a larger role in all of this than anyone realized. The pieces were coming together, but the puzzle wasn't complete. The village's suspicions were growing, and soon Miss Marple knew someone would make a mistake. But when that mistake happened, she would be ready. The truth was waiting to be uncovered, and nothing would stop her from finding it. Chapter 05. The morning following Miss Marple's conversation with the villagers found the air crisp, the pale sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the village. St. Mary Mead had always seemed peaceful, but now it was suffused with a tension that none of its residents could ignore. There was no denying it, things were changing. The quiet, picturesque village that Miss Marple had known for so long was now under the weight of a mystery that had reached into every corner. The more she learned, the more the story unfolded in unexpected ways. Edward Pierce was at the center, yes, but what was his true connection to the Darbys, to the Landills, to Edith Darby's tragic death, and now to Clara Ashton's disappearance? Miss Marple had heard the whispers and seen the uneasy glances, but there was still so much left to uncover, and she knew that the truth, when it finally came, would be far more complicated than anyone could imagine. After her encounter with the villagers in the square, Miss Marple had spent the evening considering her next steps. She had learned something important, something she had suspected, but now had confirmed. The village was turning on Edward Pierce. The whispers that had been quiet before were now growing louder. Suspicion was spreading like wildfire, and it wouldn't be long before someone took matters into their own hands. The question was, how much of what they suspected was truly the truth, and how much was just fear in disguise? As Miss Marple walked toward the Darby estate again, her thoughts were sharp and focused. She had learned from Mrs. Darby that Clara had known too much. The young woman had been a threat to someone, and her disappearance was no accident. Who had wanted her gone, and why? What had Clara discovered about the Darby family, and what had Edward Pierce's role been in it all? When Miss Marple reached the gates of the estate, she found that Mr. Hargrove was not at the door to greet her as usual. Instead, there was an unfamiliar expression on his face, one of hesitation, of uncertainty. Something had shifted within the walls of the Darby estate, and Miss Marple knew that whatever had happened, it was more than just the aftermath of Clara's disappearance. "Miss Marple," Hargrove said, his voice quieter than usual. "Mrs. Darby is expecting you, but I must warn you, she's not well. She's been distraught ever since yesterday, like you, Mr. Hargrove." Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but carrying an edge of concern. "I'll speak with her immediately." As she followed Hargrove into the house, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling beyond anyone's control. The Darby estate, once a symbol of stability in the village, had become a place of shadows, of secrets that no one could escape. Mrs. Darby was at the center of it all, but Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not just in the woman's words, but in the silence that surrounded her when Miss Marple entered the drawing room. Mrs. Darby was sitting in her usual chair by the fire, but there was a new, unsettling air about her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. It was clear that she had been crying, but there was something else, a certain weariness that Miss Marple had not seen before. The weight of the truth was bearing down on her, and Miss Marple knew that this would be the moment when the last pieces of the puzzle were put in place. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft as she approached. "I hope you're feeling better." Mrs. Darby looked up at her, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I'm not sure I can go on with this anymore. I have been keeping too many secrets that I can't hide any longer." Miss Marple took a seat across from her, her eyes watching the woman closely. She had never seen Mrs. Darby so vulnerable. The matriarch of the Darby family, always composed and controlled, was now a shell of the woman she had once been. Truth was unraveling in front of Miss Marple's eyes, and she could feel the gravity of the situation settling in her chest. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly, "I know this is difficult, but you must tell me everything. Clara's disappearance, Edith's death, and your family's involvement in the land dealings, all of it is connected. And I believe you, no more than you've told me." Mrs. Darby's lips trembled, and she closed her eyes as though trying to summon the strength to speak. "You're right," she whispered. "I've known more than I should. I've been complicit in it all, and I don't know how to make it right." Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was working quickly. "It's never too late to do the right thing, Mrs. Darby, but I need you to trust me. The truth has to come out. You've already taken the first step by speaking to me." Mrs. Darby sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of years of guilt were finally breaking through. "Edward Pierce was never supposed to be involved, Miss Marple. He came to us years ago, seeking investment for his ventures. But somewhere along the way, he became more than just a businessman. He became a partner, someone who wanted more than just land. He wanted control. And when he saw that Clara had begun asking questions, he knew she had to be silenced." Marple felt a chill creep up her spine as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. "So, you're saying that Clara's disappearance was no accident? She knew too much, and Piercy had her removed." "Yes," Mrs. Darby said, her voice thick with regret. "I tried to stop it, Miss Marple. I did. But Pierce was relentless. He had a way of getting people to do what he wanted. And when Clara started to dig into things she shouldn't have, he became worried. And so, he ordered her disappearance. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, digesting the information. Akeza, the web of lies, of manipulation, had stretched further than she had ever imagined. Clara Ashton had stumbled onto something that could have shattered the delicate balance of power in St. Mary Mead. And Edward Pierce had been willing to go to any lengths to ensure it remained buried. But why, Mrs. Darby? Miss Marple asked, gently. Why didn't you stop him? Why did you allow all of this to continue? Mrs. Darby's eyes filled with tears again, and she wiped her face with a trembling hand. I was afraid, Miss Marple. I didn't know who to trust. Carrington had his fingers in so many of our dealings, and Pierce, he was too powerful. I thought I could protect my family by keeping quiet, but now, now I realize how wrong I was. Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft but resolute. It's not too late to make things right, Mrs. Darby. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard people try to hide it. There was a long silence between them as Miss Marple let the weight of her words sink in. She could see the internal struggle within Mrs. Darby, the desire to protect herself and her family, and the growing realization that the only way to move forward was to confront the truth. I'm afraid it's already too late, Mrs. Darby said, her voice barely above a whisper. The damage has been done. The consequences will be far-reaching. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her mind already racing with the next steps. The truth was now clearer than ever, but the final confrontation was still ahead. Perhaps, Mrs. Darby, but we must still act. There is no time to waste. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she felt the weight of the village's secrets pressing in on her. There was no going back now. The storm was coming, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. But there were still many questions left unanswered, and Miss Marple knew that only one thing was certain. The truth would be revealed, no matter the cost. And in the end, it would be more than just a mystery solved. It would be the undoing of a long-standing conspiracy, one that had held St. Mary Mead in its grip for far too long. The game was coming to an end, and Miss Marple was ready to see it through to the very last revelation. Chapter 05. The next morning dawned bright and cool, the sun casting long shadows over St. Mary Mead. There was a crispness in the air that made the village feel unusually sharp, as if the atmosphere had been cleared by the weight of the revelations that had come to light in the last few days. Miss Marple, as always, was up early. The quiet of the morning, when the village had yet to stir, gave her the time she needed to think, to piece together the events of the past week. As she walked down the winding path toward the village center, she couldn't shake the sense that the clock was ticking. Clara's disappearance had become more than a mystery. It had become a symbol of the secrets festering in the heart of the village. But those secrets were no longer hidden behind closed doors. They were being exposed bit by bit, and Miss Marple knew that the final pieces were nearly in place. She could sense it in the air. The truth was almost within reach. The villagers, however, had not yet realized the full scope of the situation. They were still looking at each other with suspicion, but they hadn't yet connected all the dots. Most of them had already begun to suspect Edward Pierce, their whispers growing louder by the day. Miss Marple knew that the truth was more complex than they thought. Pierce was involved, yes, but there was someone else pulling the strings out, a person who had been in control of the situation all along. As Miss Marple approached the village square, she noticed a small gathering near the fountain. It was a handful of familiar faces, local farmers, a few shopkeepers, and, to her surprise, Dorothy Thompson, who was standing off to the side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple knew Dorothy well. A tease. The woman was always eager to share a bit of gossip, but today she seemed more serious, more reserved. "Good morning, Dorothy," Miss Marple said softly, her voice pleasant but carrying an edge of concern. Dorothy turned, startled for a moment, before breaking into a half-hearted smile. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." She paused, glancing over her shoulder at the others in the group. "I suppose we're all a bit on edge these days, with everything going on with Clara. Well, people have been talking." "I understand," Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp. "But talking, Dorothy, can sometimes lead to confusion. Have you learned anything that might shed some light on the situation?" Dorothy hesitated for a moment, her fingers twitching nervously, as if she were trying to suppress the urge to say more. Then, after a deep breath, she spoke, her voice low. "There's been talk about Edward Pierce, Miss Marple. You know, people have been saying all sorts of things about him. They think he's behind Clara's disappearance, and ... I can't help but wonder if they're right." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing nod. "You're not the only one who's wondering that, Dorothy. But there's more to this than just Pierce. There's something we're all overlooking." Dorothy looked at Miss Marple, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple lowered her voice, speaking quietly, so that only Dorothy could hear. "Clara's disappearance, the murder of Edith Darby, the strange behavior of Edward Pierce, it's all connected. The thread that ties it all together goes much deeper than anyone realizes." Dorothy swallowed, glancing nervously at the others in the group. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? Are you saying that there's someone else involved?" "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but filled with quiet certainty. "Kay, and the truth is far more complicated than any of us imagined." "Kay." Before Dorothy could respond, one of the men in the group, a local farmer named Harold Finch, stepped forward. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, his tone sharp but curious. "Do you think you know something we don't?" Miss Marple gave him a small smile. "It's not about what I know, Harold. It's about what we all know. The facts are out there, if we just look closely enough." Harold looked at her suspiciously, but didn't push the matter further. The tension in the air was palpable, and Miss Marple could see that the villagers were all growing restless, waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to make a move. "Miss Marple," Dorothy said softly, "I've been hearing rumors. People are saying that Edward Pierce has been involved in some shady dealings, even before Clara disappeared. Do you think he's capable of murder?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Dorothy's face. "Think," she began slowly, "that Edward Pierce is hiding something. But murder, that's a bit more complicated than that." Dorothy seemed unconvinced, but before she could speak again, Miss Marple raised a hand, signaling that the conversation needed to end for the moment. Should all be. "Careful, Dorothy," Miss Marple said. "The truth is often a slippery thing, and sometimes we believe we know something when, in fact, we don't. But we'll get to the bottom of this." With that, Miss Marple turned and began walking away, her thoughts already focused on the next step in her investigation. She had learned enough to know that the truth was within reach, but the path to it was fraught with danger. The villagers were on edge, and their suspicions were growing, but they hadn't yet uncovered the true nature of the conspiracy that had been playing out behind closed doors. As she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Edward Pierce once again. The man had been a quiet presence in the village, an enigma wrapped in mystery, but his involvement in the disappearance of Clara Ashton seemed undeniable. And the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized that Pierce was a man of many layers, each one more carefully constructed than the last dot. What Miss Marple had uncovered so far had only scratched the surface, but she could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. The involvement of the Darby family, the strange relationship between Pierce and the other villagers, and the dark forces lurking just beneath the surface were all part of a much larger story. She was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local library to look for any new records or clues that might shed light on Pierce's past. The library, though small, was a treasure trove of information. Old village records, newspaper clippings, and journals filled the shelves. Miss Marple had always found the quiet atmosphere of the library comforting, as it gave her the time and space to focus her thoughts. She was flipping through a stack of old newspapers, and something caught her eye. An article dated a few years earlier. The headline read, "Local businessman Edward Pierce buys property on Darby Estate." Miss Marple's fingers froze on the page as she read the article more closely. Pierce had been involved with the Darby Estate long before the murder of Edith Darby, long before Clara's disappearance. But it was what followed in the article that truly caught Miss Marple's attention. Edward Pierce, a local businessman with a history of property investments, has recently made a significant purchase of land from the Darby Estate. Sources say Pierce has been actively seeking to expand his holdings in St. Mary Mead, but no details have been released on the purpose of the acquisition. It was the word "sources" that stuck in Miss Marple's mind. If Pierce had been involved with the Darby Estate for so long, what was he really after? Was it just land and money? Or was there something more to his interest in the Darby family? Miss Marple knew the answer would lie in the deeper connections that had remained hidden in plain sight for far too long. As Miss Marple carefully placed the newspaper back on the shelf, she couldn't help but feel the storm growing stronger. The quiet village was no longer a haven of secrets. It was a battlefield, and the final confrontation was drawing closer with each passing hour. The truth was about to come to light, and when it did, St. Mary Mead would never be the same. Miss Marple's mind raced as she walked back through the village square. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but there was still so much left unsaid. Edward Pierce was at the heart of everything, but his involvement was deeper, more calculated than anyone in the village had imagined. The connections between him, the Darby Estate, and Clara Ashton's disappearance were beginning to reveal themselves, but with every discovery, the mystery only grew more tangled. The discovery of the article about Edward Pierce's purchase of land from the Darby Estate had confirmed something Miss Marple had suspected. Pierce's interest in the Darbys went far beyond mere acquaintance. His sudden acquisition of land, coupled with his secretive behavior in the web of power he had spun, suggested that his motives weren't purely financial. There was something more at stakes, something far darker. But what? As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, she felt the oppressive weight of the village's suspicion hanging over her like a storm cloud. The gossip was growing louder. The whispers about Pierce and his possible role in Clara's disappearance had reached every corner of St. Mary Mead, and soon they would reach a boiling point. But Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions. She had seen too many times how fear could twist the truth, and she needed to keep her focus sharp. Her thoughts turned back to the Darby Estate and the revelations Mrs. Darby had reluctantly shared. The Darbys, for all their wealth and status, were just as tangled in this mess as everyone else. But there was something else that nagged at Miss Marple. Something in Mrs. Darby's words that had hinted at a deeper, connectional relationship with Edward Pierce that went beyond business dealings. It was clear that Mrs. Darby had been trying to protect her family, but now Miss Marple knew she had to be held accountable. The truth was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy for anyone involved. As she approached her front door, Miss Marple paused. There was a figure standing in the doorway of her cottage, a figure she recognized immediately. It was Hawkins, Constable Hawkins, who had become her most trusted ally throughout this investigation. His face was serious, his eyes searching. Miss Marple could tell that something had changed, that the village was on the cusp of something big. "Miss Marple," Hawkins said, his voice low and urgent. "You're going to want to hear this." Miss Marple stepped inside, and Hawkins followed her, closing the door behind him. He looked at her with a mixture of caution and resolve. "We've been doing some more digging into Edward Pierce," he said, "and we found something. Something that could change everything." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Hawkins." Hawkins pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Miss Marple. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a letter from Edward Pierce, written in a hand that Miss Marple recognized from the earlier note she had found. This letter, however, was addressed to someone else entirely, and the words written on it were chilling. "I know what you're planning, and I can't let you do it. You've made your move, and now I'll make mine. I'll see to it that your secrets stay buried, and if anyone tries to uncover them, they'll regret it. Okay. Stay out of my way, or there will be consequences." The letter was dated just a few days before Clara's disappearance. Miss Marple felt a shiver run down her spine. The message was clear. Edward Pierce was not just protecting his own interests. He was threatening anyone who dared to challenge him. But who had he been writing to? And what were these secrets that he was so desperate to keep hidden? Hawkins watched her closely, sensing her thoughts. "We think this letter was sent to someone in the Darby family," he said quietly. "Perhaps to Mrs. Darby herself. But it doesn't explain why he felt the need to issue such a threat. And it doesn't explain why Clara disappeared right after. How did she know? Miss Marple? What was she about to uncover?" Miss Marple paused, her fingers still lightly gripping the letter. She had no doubt that the letter was significant. Pierce's words were not just a threat, they were a warning. And Miss Marple could sense that this was the moment everything was about to change. Clara must have found something. Miss Marple murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Something about Pierce's dealings with the Darbys, and whatever it was, it made her a target. Hawkins nodded, but his face was troubled. "There's something else, Miss Marple. We've spoken to some of the villagers, and there's been talk about Pierce being seen in the woods the night Clara disappeared. People said he was meeting someone. There's someone who was supposed to be helping him with something, but nobody knows who." Miss Marple's mind raced. If Pierce had been meeting someone in the woods, it was likely that the meeting had been about something much more dangerous than land deals. It was clear now that Pierce was involved in something far more complicated, something that reached beyond the village and into darker territories. "Do you have any idea who this person might be?" Miss Marple asked, her tone sharp. "We're still looking into it," Hawkins replied, "but I think it's someone from the Darby estate. People we've spoken to mentioned that Pierce had been acting suspiciously around the time of Clara's disappearance. He was talking about finishing things." Miss Marple's mind was already piecing the fragments of the puzzle together. Pierce had been involved in a dangerous game with the Darbys, and Clara had unwittingly stepped into the middle of it. She had known something, perhaps, something about the land dealings, perhaps about the hidden power dynamics within the Darby family that had made her a threat. And now, with Clara gone, Miss Marple knew that the village was in grave danger of being caught in the wake of something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. "We need to find out who he was meeting," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "It's the key to everything." Hawkins nodded, his expression grim. "I'll gather more information, but I'm afraid time is running out, Miss Marple. People are starting to get desperate. The villagers want answers, and they're not going to wait much longer." Miss Marple stood, her hands clasped behind her back. "We must be careful, Hawkins. The truth is never as simple as it seems. There are forces at play here that we can't even begin to understand, but we will find them." As Hawkins left her cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letter. Pierce had been hiding something important, and whatever that secret was, it was bound to be the key to unlocking the entire mystery. But the deeper Miss Marple dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The web of lies was tightening, and soon someone would make a mistake. Miss Marple had been in enough mysteries to know that the final confrontation was always the most dangerous. But she had one advantage that no one else had: the ability to see through the fog, to recognize the truth hidden beneath the surface. And in this case, the truth was more elusive than ever. But Miss Marple wasn't afraid. She had faced darker secrets before, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The storm was coming, and she would be ready for it. Chapter 06. The morning air was heavy with the scent of rain, the clouds hanging low in the sky as Miss Marple made her way to the heart of the village. There was a sense of impending change in the air, a tension that had been building ever since Clara Ashton's disappearance. The villagers had become more cautious, their movements slower, as if each step was weighted with the fear that the truth might be just around the corner, ready to be uncovered. Miss Marple, however, had long learned to deal with such tension. It was in the quiet spaces between the events, in the subtle shifts of behavior, where the truth revealed itself. The village might be gripped by fear, but she could see the details no one else could. The small things, the little inconsistencies, the hesitations, the things people didn't want to admit, even to themselves. And that was what she was after. The truth, she knew, was hidden in plain sight. It always had been. As she walked past the village's weathered stone buildings, Miss Marple's mind raced with the latest discoveries. Edward Pierce's involvement was now undeniable. He had been the thread running through all of it, from the Darby estate to Clara's disappearance, and even Edith Darby's untimely death. But what had been his true purpose in all of this? Miss Marple's suspicions were clear. Pierce wasn't just a pawn in the game. Kay was playing a far more dangerous game of his own, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized that there was more at stake than anyone had imagined. Her first stop was the local post office, where she had learned that the villagers had begun to gather their own conclusions about Pierce's involvement. The whispers had grown louder, and it wasn't long before someone would take matters into their own hands. Miss Marple knew she had to act before that happened. The village's suspicions reached their boiling point. There would be no turning back. The truth would be buried beneath the weight of fear and vengeance. Inside the post office, Miss Marple was greeted by a few familiar faces, but it was the older postmistress, Mrs. Whittaker, who caught her attention. Mrs. Whittaker had been in the village for as long as anyone could remember. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her subtle nature made her an invaluable source of information when it came to the affairs of St. Mary Mead. "Good morning, Mrs. Whittaker," Miss Marple said, her voice as calm as ever. "I trust you're well." Mrs. Whittaker glanced up from behind the counter, offering Miss Marple a small but knowing smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You look like you're about to solve another mystery. Are you making any headway with Clara's disappearance?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I believe so, but it's a complex situation, Mrs. Whittaker. There are more twists and turns than I had anticipated." Mrs. Whittaker's expression softened with understanding. "I know what you mean. People are talking, Miss Marple. It's a lot of fear in the air, and it's not just about Clara anymore. People are beginning to wonder what exactly Edward Pierce's role in all of this really is." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are they saying, Mrs. Whittaker? Kay, what are the villagers thinking about Pierce? Kay?" Mrs. Whittaker glanced around the room, as if ensuring no one was listening in, before speaking in a low voice. "They're all suspicious of him, Miss Marple. He's been acting strange always, looking over his shoulder, never letting anyone get too close. People are saying he's behind Clara's disappearance, that he's got something to hide. But they don't know what." Miss Marple's mind turned over the information like a puzzle. "And what do you think, Mrs. Whittaker? Do you believe Pierce is guilty?" Mrs. Whittaker's eyes shifted, her fingers idly sorting the papers on the counter as she spoke. "It's hard to say. He's always been a bit of a mystery, hasn't he? Came to town not long ago. Seemed friendly enough, but there's something about him. I never trusted him. Not completely. But I don't know if he's capable of something like this." Miss Marple paused for a moment, then asked, "Have you heard anything about his connection to the Darby family?" To Carrington, at the mention of Henry Carrington's name, Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened slightly. "Carrington, you say? Okay. That's a name I haven't heard in years. But yes, I remember him. He was always around, you know, in and out of the village. People said he was involved in some very shady dealings with the Darbys. Tease. Never anything that could be proven. But the rumors, ... well, they're the sort that stick." Psst. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "And what about Pierce? Is he involved with Carrington?" Mrs. Whitaker hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing her words. "Pierce? Yes, I'd say so. I remember seeing them together once in town." Carrington was all smiles. Of course, he always was. But Pierce, ... he wasn't so friendly. It was like he was trying to hide something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, ... She trailed off, the implication hanging heavily between them. Miss Marple's mind was racing. Carrington, Pierce, the land deals, the Darby family. There was a pattern emerging, one that she hadn't quite understood until now. Edward Pierce hadn't just been a quiet observer in the village. He had been involved in something far more insidious. And now, with Clara's disappearance, the truth was inching ever closer to the surface. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Whitaker and left the post office, her thoughts tumbling over one another. The village was on edge. That much was clear. But what was more alarming was the feeling that someone knew the truth, yet was withholding it. Pierce was playing a dangerous game, and the deeper Miss Marple dug, the more she realized that no one was entirely innocent in this mystery. Clara, Edith Darby, and even the villagers, everyone had a part to play in this tangled web. As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, her steps quickening, she considered her next move. She needed to speak to more people to get it clearer picture of Pierce's relationship with the Darbys, with Carrington, and with the village as a whole. But time was running out. The villagers' suspicions were growing, and it wouldn't be long before someone took matters into their own hands. Miss Marple knew that she had to act quickly, for the truth was buried beneath a weight of fear and accusations. The final pieces of the puzzle were within her reach, but first she had to confront the one person who had been at the center of it, Uled Ward Pierce. She couldn't let him slip through her fingers now. There was no time to waste. The game was nearly over, and Miss Marple was ready to make the final move. The truth was close at hand, and once it came to light, everything would change. Tools, the days were slipping by quickly now, each moment pulling Miss Marple closer to the inevitable conclusion. The sense of urgency had grown in the village. Tension crackled in the air like an electric charge, and Miss Marple could feel it too. Her steps were measured, but quick, as she made her way to the Darby estate once again. The puzzle was nearly complete, but there were still a few key pieces left to uncover. Edward Pierce's role was clearer than ever, but there were details, subtle clues that still needed tying together. The letter found in the woods had been a breakthrough, confirming much of what Miss Marple had suspected about Pierce's motives. It was clear now that Clara's disappearance wasn't just a random event, it was a calculated move, and one with far-reaching consequences. But it was the nature of Pierce's involvement with the Darby family, and, more specifically, his ties to Henry Carrington, that had become the central thread. These two men had been part of a much larger scheme, one that had remained hidden for far too long. The morning was cool, but the rising wind hinted at the storm that Miss Marple knew was coming. The village, though still bustling with activity, seemed to have taken on a quieter air. It was as if the villagers were waiting for something. person's nerves stretched tight with the anticipation of the inevitable revelation. Miss Marple had learned to read people over the years, and she knew when a community was on the brink of a breaking point. As Miss Marple approached the imposing gates of the Darby estate, she felt the familiar unease wash over her. A tea she had visited this estate many times before, but now it seemed like a different place altogether. The grandeur of the estate, which had once seemed so secure, now felt like a fortress on the verge of crumbling. It was a house of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover every last one. Mr. Hargrove, the Darby butler, was waiting at the door, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a subtle tension. His eyes flickered nervously as he greeted. Miss Marple, he said, his voice more strained than usual. Mrs. Darby is expecting you, but I must warn you she's not in a good state today. She's been, unsettled ever since the letter arrived. Miss Marple's heart sank at the mention of the letter. The fact that Mrs. Darby was disturbed suggested that the truth was closer than she had thought. Mrs. Darby had been hiding something before the revelation of the letter had clearly broken her. It was time to confront the woman with everything Miss Marple had uncovered. I understand, Mr. Hargrove, Miss Marple replied gently, her voice calm but resolute. I will speak with her now. As Miss Marple entered the drawing room, she saw Mrs. Darby seated by the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The usual grace of the woman was gone, replaced by a hollow weariness that seemed to have aged her by years. Her once imposing presence now seemed fragile. A woman overwhelmed by the weight of her own secrets. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said softly, her voice lacking the usual authority. I was hoping you would come, Kay. I'm afraid I have no more strength to hide it any longer. Miss Marple took a seat across from her, watching the woman closely. It's not easy, is it, Mrs. Darby? The truth has a way of forcing its way to the surface, no matter how hard we try to bury it. Mrs. Darby didn't respond immediately. She sat with her gaze fixed on the fire, her hands trembling slightly. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she finally spoke, her voice filled with quiet resignation. You were right, Miss Marple. All along, you were right. Clara, she knew too much. I tried to protect her, tried to keep her out of it, but she was determined. She was so much like Edith, always asking questions. And when Clara started to dig into the land dealings, when she started to ask about Carrington, I knew it was only a matter of time before she uncovered everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her thoughts quickening. Everything, Mrs. Darby. What exactly did Clara uncover? And how does this tie back to Edward Pierce and Henry Carrington? Mrs. Darby looked up at her, her face filled with a mix of fear and guilt. Carrington, he was the mastermind behind it all, Miss Marple. But Pierce, Pierce was the one who did the dirty work. He and Carrington had a partnership, and when Clara started to question Carrington's dealings, she became a threat to them both. She was too close to uncovering the truth. Miss Marple's mind was racing. She had suspected that the relationship between Pierce and Carrington was far more complicated than anyone realized, but now it seemed as though it went deeper than just a few shady land deals. There was something darker at play, a conspiracy that tied the fate of Clara Ashton, Edith Darby, and the very future of St. Mary Mead together. You don't mean to say that Clara was killed because of what she found out about the land deals? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Darby nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears. Yes, that's exactly it. Clara discovered that Carrington and Pierce had been funneling money through the estate, using the land as a cover for something much more nefarious. They had manipulated the village for years, buying up land, influencing votes, all to serve their own interests. Okay, and when Clara found out, she threatened to expose it all. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, taking a moment to process The new information. It made sense now. The land deals, the mysterious deaths, and the sudden disappearance of Clariette was all part of a larger scheme. Carrington and Pierce had been using the Darby estate to further their own power and wealth. And when Clara got too close to the truth, she had become expendable. But why, Mrs. Darby? Miss Marple asked gently. Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you protect Clara? Mrs. Darby closed her eyes, her face filled with sorrow. I was afraid, Miss Marple. Afraid of what would happen if I went against them. Pierce was dangerous, and Carrington, he had so much influence. I thought if I stayed silent, if I kept the peace, I could protect my family. But I was wrong. I see that now. I see that all of it, everything was a lie. The weight of Mrs. Darby's words hung in the air, thick with the burden of years of deception. Miss Marple had always known that the truth would come out in the end. But now it was clear that the village's darkest secrets were far more dangerous than anyone had realized. I believe you, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with quiet understanding. But the truth doesn't come without consequences, and you must face them, as hard as that may be. Mrs. Darby looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. I know, but I can't keep running from it any longer. It's time for everything to come out. I'll do whatever I can to help you, Miss Marple. I'll tell you everything. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. The truth was finally within reach, but the storm that had been brewing in St. Mary Mead was just beginning to break. There was still more to uncover, and Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation with Edward Pierce was inevitable as she rose to leave. Miss Marple turned back to Mrs. Darby. Stay strong, Mrs. Darby. We'll see this through to the end. The truth was closer than ever, but Miss Marple knew that it would come at a cost. Pierce's time was running out, and soon the web of lies he had spun would unravel, exposing everything he had tried to hide. And when it did, St. Mary Mead would never be the same. Tools, ChatGPT said. Chapter 07. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon by the time Miss Marple made her way toward the village square again. The weight of the day's revelations still heavy in her mind. The truth about Edward Pierce and his involvement with the Darby estate was now undeniable. He had been manipulating the village, hiding his true intentions under layers of charm and calculated silence. But now, with Clara's disappearance and Edith's death, the mask had finally begun to crack, revealing a conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple's thoughts were sharp as she passed by the shops and cottages of St. Mary Mead, her eyes scanning the familiar faces of the villagers. The tension in the air was almost palpable now, the quiet whispers of suspicion growing louder with each passing day. The villagers were beginning to suspect Pierce, but Miss Marple knew better. The truth wasn't as simple as they believed. Pierce was only part of the puzzle, the real mastermind, the person who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, still lurking in the shadows. Her mind wandered back to her conversation with Mrs. Darby. The woman had finally confessed what Miss Marple had suspected. All along, that Pierce and Carrington were partners in a web of deception, using the Darby estate to further their own ends. It was all about power over the land, over the village, and over the people who lived there. And when Clara had stumbled upon their secrets, she had become a liability, someone to be silenced before the truth could escape. But as Miss Marple walked, the knowing feeling in her gut told her there was more to the story. What had really driven Clara to dig so deeply into the Darby estate's dealings? What had she uncovered that had made her such a threat? And why had Edward Pierce gone to such extreme lengths to hide the truth? Why the questions swirled in her mind, growing more urgent with each step. Miss Marple knew that she was close to unraveling the final piece of the mystery, but she had to act carefully. Pierce was dangerous, and the web he had woven was not something easily untangled. She needed to find the one thing that would expose him once, okay? And for all the missing piece that would link everything together as she reached the village square. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a familiar figure standing near the fountain. It was Harold Finch, the local farmer who had been part of the conversation with Dorothy the other day. He was speaking with two other men, both of them villagers Miss Marple had seen around, but didn't know well. The conversation was low, but Miss Marple could see the intensity in their body language. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good. Miss Marple approached them slowly, her steps deliberate but calm. She had learned over the years that the best way to get people to reveal the truth was by listening, by giving them the space to speak before they realized what they were saying. "Good evening, Harold," Miss Marple said, her voice light but carrying an edge of authority. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Harold looked up, startled for a moment, before his expression softened into a forced smile. "Miss Marple, no, not at all. Just a little chat about the happenings around here." Miss Marple could see that he was uneasy, but she didn't push him. She waited, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. Finally, Harold spoke, his voice low. "It's about Pierce, Miss Marple," he said, glancing over at the two men beside him. "We've been talking, and it's something we've all been wondering. You know, the village has been on edge ever since Clara disappeared, and the more we think about it, the more it seems like Pierce is at the center of it all." Miss Marple nodded slightly, but her gaze was steady. "I agree. Edward Pierce has been involved, shall we say, in quite a bit. But there's more to it than just him, but someone else pulling the strings." The two men beside Harold exchanged uneasy glances, but Harold's eyes were fixed on Miss Marple. "We've been talking to a few people, Miss Marple, and we've learned something. Something we think you should know. Pierce has been making arrangements with someone else. We don't know who exactly, but we've seen him meeting with a man at the edge of the woods several times." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A meeting in the woods. This was the break she had been waiting for. She had heard about Pierce's suspicious behavior, but this was different. Pierce had been meeting with someone in secret, then there was something far more significant at play. "What did you hear, Harold?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Who was Pierce meeting with?" Harold shook his head, his brow furrowed. "We don't know. We saw them together, but they were always careful. Whoever he was meeting, they didn't want anyone to see. We tried to follow them once, but they were too quick. They disappeared into the trees." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind already working. The pieces were starting to fit together. This meeting, whoever it was with, could be the key to everything. But what was it they were discussing? What was so important that Pierce would go to such lengths to hide it? Teen need to know more about these meetings, Harold, Miss Marple said, her voice sharper now. "It's critical that we find out who Pierce is working with. If you can, watch for any more signs of these meetings. They could be the key to unraveling everything." Harold nodded, his face tense with the weight of the situation. "We'll keep an eye out, Miss Marple, but we're all on edge. Talk in the village about what might happen if we don't do something soon." Miss Marple knew what Harold was implying. The villagers were becoming restless. The whispers had grown louder, and it wouldn't be long before someone took matters into their own hands. The truth was so close, yet so many people were still looking in the wrong places. If she didn't act quickly, the situation could spiral out of control. "I'll be watching too," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but calm. "But you must be discreet. No one can know what we're uncovering just yet. Not until we're sure." She left the village square and made her way back to her cottage. Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The villagers were right to be afraid. Pierce was dangerous, and whoever he was working with was just as dangerous. But Miss Marple wasn't afraid. She had seen darker forces at work before, and she knew that the key to solving this mystery lay not in confrontation, but in careful observation. She had to act quickly, before the storm broke and before Edward Pierce disappeared into the shadows once again. The truth was within reach. But the final pieces of the puzzle would require more than just observation. It would require the patience to wait for the right moment, and Miss Marple was prepared to wait. After all, she had seen this play out before, and in the end, the truth always came to light. The following days passed with an uneasy calm, the villagers whispering more openly as the weight of suspicion settled over Edward Pierce. The discovery of the secret meetings in the woods had fueled their fears, and Miss Marple could see the tension growing in the village like a storm ready to break. It was clear that something had to be done, and soon, but Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation would need to be carefully planned. The truth, as always, lay in the details, the smallest things that everyone else overlooked. Though she had received more reports from the villagers about Pierce's movements and interactions, Miss Marple felt no closer to uncovering the full scope of the mystery. The meeting in the woods remained elusive, its significance growing with every passing day. Yet, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the answer lay in one last piece of the puzzle, one crucial detail that had yet to reveal itself. After a long day of visiting with several of the local shopkeepers and gathering information, Miss Marple decided to return to her cottage for some much-needed reflection. The village was still buzzing with talk of Pierce's suspicious behavior, and though she had spoken with Hawkins and a few of the other villagers, she knew that time was running out. If she didn't act soon, someone would take matters into their own hands. The villagers were on edge, and one wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. As Miss Marple sat by the fire in her cozy sitting room, her thoughts drifted back to the Darby estate and the conversations she had had with Mrs. Darby. The older woman's confession had been a turning point in the investigation. Mrs. Darby had admitted to her role in the cover-up and revealed the extent of Pierce's manipulation. Yet, there was still something unsettling about the whole situation. Mrs. Darby had spoken of secrets, but what those secrets truly entailed remained unclear. And while Miss Marple had learned much, she still wasn't certain what had driven Pierce to go to such lengths to protect his empire. Why had he been so desperate to silence Clara? What did she know that had made her a target? As Miss Marple pondered these questions, the sound of a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She rose from her chair and opened the door to find Mr. Hargrove standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. Miss Marple said in a low voice, "I've just received word from the village constable. There's been an incident. It's Clara Ashton. Her body has been found." Miss Marple's heart sank, though her expression remained calm. This was the moment she had feared. Clara Ashton, the young woman who had unknowingly stepped into the heart of a dangerous conspiracy, had paid the ultimate price for her curiosity. The truth about her disappearance was now painfully clear, and the village was about to be shaken to its core. "I'll come at once, Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, though inside, her mind was racing with the implications of this new development. Clara's death was no longer just a disappearance, it was now a murder, and with it came the final push toward unraveling the full extent of the conspiracy that had been quietly simmering in the village for so long. As Miss Marple followed Mr. Hargrove through the winding streets of St. Mary Mead, she could feel the unease settling into her bones. The village had never been this tense. People stood in their doorways, watching, waiting for something to happen, but no one dared speak. The shadow of suspicion hung heavy in the air when they arrived at the spot where Clara's body had been found. Miss Marple saw Hawkins speaking with a group of villagers. His face was grim, his body tense as he spoke to the onlookers. But when he saw Miss Marple approaching, his expression softened slightly. "Miss Marple," Hawkins greeted her, his voice low. "I wish this weren't the reason you had to come. Clara's body was found not far from the old oak tree. She's been there for a few days, it seems." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to the spot where Clara's body had been discovered. The area was quiet, eerily so, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She couldn't help but wonder if Clara had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have, something that had sealed her fate. But there was still much they didn't know. Clara had been too close to the truth, whatever that truth was, and now it seemed her death was the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple took a deep breath and turned to Hawkins. "Have you been able to gather any details about how she died?" Hawkins shook his head. "We've only just discovered the body, Miss Marple. There's no sign of a struggle, but there's something strange about the way she was positioned. Almost like she was placed there intentionally." "Intentionally," Miss Marple repeated, her interest piqued. "What do you mean? There's no sign of violence, no marks on her body, while she was found with her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she was sleeping," Hawkins explained. "It's unsettling, okay? And there's something else. She was clutching something in her hand, a piece of paper, but we haven't been able to retrieve it yet. It's just ... strange." Miss Marple's mind began to race. The way Clara's body had been arranged seemed deliberate, almost as though the killer had been trying to send a message. And the piece of paper Clara had been holding, what was it? Was it a final clue? Something Clara had discovered before her death? The thought sent a chill through Miss Marple, but she kept her composure. This wasn't the time to jump to conclusions. The evidence would speak for itself. They were patient enough to read between the lines. "I'd like to see the body," Miss Marple said quietly, "and I'd like to examine that piece of paper for myself." Hawkins nodded, though his eyes were filled with concern. "I understand, Miss Marple, but please, be careful. This isn't just a case of a missing woman anymore. Cass murder, and whoever did this is still out there." Miss Marple gave him a reassuring smile. "I'll be careful, Hawkins, but the truth is always worth the risk." As they approached Clara's body, Miss Marple's thoughts were a blur of questions and possibilities. Clara's death had escalated the mystery into something far more dangerous, and Miss Marple knew that they were now on the edge of uncovering something that would shake St. Mary Mead to its core. Oh, but with each new clue, with each step closer to the truth, the stakes were growing higher. The final confrontation was imminent. And when it came, the village of St. Mary Mead would never be the same again.